Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Mohsen Mostafavi, the former dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, discusses his new book Sharing Tokyo. This audio was taken from an event hosted at the Tank Reading Rooms this November.
I've been working on a series of research projects since I stepped down as doing kind of administration and things like that, and focusing mainly on my teaching and pedagogy, and decided to devote part of, or a reasonable chunk of my work to Japan. And that's because I also have a kind of long history from almost the time when I was a child in Iran, and my father working with the Japanese and having Japanese people visit our home and things like that, to then being here, working with Shin when he was doing these projects in Niigata that we had, but also having this friendship with people like Toyo Ito, Sejima, and others over the years. And then at Harvard, I started doing a lot of projects, especially a program called Studio Abroad, where we send people for one semester to live in another country. And this was partly because it was very difficult, if you know, at that time, to get these well-known architects to come and spend. They were on our faculty, but if they came for like once every 3 weeks, we were very lucky. So as a solution to try and have this closer relationship with them, I established this thing called Studio Abroad, and one was in Rotterdam, where the students lived in Rotterdam and had space in the office of OMA, and one in Basel with Herzog on the Marne, and one of them was also in Tokyo with Toyo Ito. And there were others, but those were the three main ones. And then when that kind of program came to an end, I decided that I was going to focus some of my own efforts and energy on Japan. And this is why I'm teaching courses related to Japan. I've had to study quite a bit during the pandemic when I had a sabbatical, and then to visit when possible. And it wasn't possible, of course, because of the pandemic until maybe last year, when we started visiting with graduate students. But what I do is that I have also some people who work with me, including a very close colleague called Kayoko Ota, who is also the co-editor of this book with me. And she's based there, and that's how I could basically survive with this research during the pandemic, because she was able to support and help me, as well as I had also some of my students who were living and working in Japan. So we started producing a website called japanstory.org, which documents basically some of the research, interviews, conversations, as well as the creation of design research, because unfortunately the Japanese don't have so many books about the more recent history of Japanese architecture and urbanization. There are tons of books about Toyo Ito and Sejima and Su Fujimoto, these architects, these iconic architects, but actually there are not so many books about the history of the city in a way. And part of that is because the city itself hasn't been analyzed. So an aspect of our research has been focused on basically unraveling the history of the city through drawings, and see how the urban morphology has evolved, because essentially the city of Tokyo is a city that has been referred to as a high city and a low city, because it was a feudal town The feudal lords lived in the high city, and the rest of the population lived in the low city. And that didn't mean that they were just working class. They were not part of the feudal aristocracy in some way. And this topography still remains in Japan today because there's a very well-known railway line called the Yamanote line, which is basically is a circular line that covers this whole upper part of the town compared to other parts of the city. And part of this research also then focuses on the question of, okay, so what is the future of architecture in that kind of context? What are you to do? Because I'm not going to go into it too much. I think I've already talked a lot about, before I get into the book. But just to let you know that, for example, architects like Toyo Ito or Sejima don't really, they have projects in Tokyo, but they don't really work in Tokyo in the way that sometimes we see British architects having an impact on the character of the city because they're working on housing projects or things like this. And you could say that to some degree they've been excluded from working in the city because of the fact that the development of the city is fundamentally something that is organized through private capital. And because of that, it means that there are a series of big organizations, mainly in the context of Tokyo, in fact, 3 big developers who have essentially a kind of monopoly of the city. And they have land banks, which they have acquired over a long period of time. And then they end up doing very, very big projects. And I'm going to explain a couple of things. But if you visit, you can't not be impressed by the control in some ways that these big companies have. And what they do are very high-end, they're very exclusive, and because of the amount of investment, because sometimes they're spending 20 years, 25 years acquiring an area to be able to do the development, therefore, those developments are not really accessible to the vast majority of the population. And in contrast to that are the neighborhoods, which are smaller scale areas that exist, and architects are doing very petite kind of little projects, but some very interesting projects. And so the challenge is that those small projects are not enough, and the big projects are exclusionary to some degree. Therefore, how to share the city, how to make the city, in a way, more accessible to a kind of larger portion of the population. And I should say that this work is also something that is on the one hand based on Tokyo, but we could also be talking on one level about Osaka, because we're talking about metropolitan areas and the formation of metropolitan areas. And we have a separate research project, which I'm not going to show you or discuss today, which is really about the rest of Japan, where you have the problematics, if you like, of regional cities or regional towns, and the fact that the regional areas, in rural areas, they're also losing people to local migration to metropolitan areas, as well as the fact that the broader context for this research is that Japan is depopulating. Japan is going through a rapid process of depopulation, and this question of degrowth is also really the subtext for this research, whether we are in Tokyo or whether we are in the regional cities. So, so this book, as I said, is in collaboration with Kawako Ota, but also I work with a Japanese graphic designer who is based in LA, and so it's a kind of interesting thing having one person in Tokyo, one person in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one person who's Japanese, and is based in LA. And in fact, that was part of the reason why I was interested in working with that particular graphic designer, to really have some of this kind of sensibility, which is part and parcel of the book, be present in terms of the graphic design. So just very quickly to tell you something about the structure of the book, the first part of this book is really trying to explain a little bit the case for degrowth and what is happening as a kind of consequence of neoliberal policies and the role of capitalism in terms of urban development. The second part is about these large-scale developments and the big developers, and how basically the formation of the city is so tied to these big, large-scale private developments. The third section is about the idea of neighborhoods. And the fourth section, architecture as urbanism, is really looking for alternative strategies, something which is maybe between the large-scale developments of the developers and the neighborhood concept, and what could that be. And apart from the question of the relationship to capital, the relationship to private development, there's of course the subtext of the kind of alternative political circumstances for bringing about different kinds of projects, because that's part of the challenge. I work with a very I think very interesting Japanese photographer, Hasegawa-san, who is, we tried to, again, this is sort of at the tail end of the pandemic, trying to capture for the reader something of the character of Tokyo that's not the tourist view, and it's not the obvious view. So he spent quite a lot of time traveling, trying to also capture this idea of sharing. But here I'm just giving you a sense of, for example, in this image you can see the interior of a block in a way that you don't normally experience. Or if you look at the front buildings, you see that some buildings are not unlike what might be in London, but other ones are narrower and they're taller, and some are really quite narrow in a way that we wouldn't have, more or less one room wide or 1.5 rooms wide. So I think capturing something of that look and feel of the city and some of the kind of temporal qualities, as well as the way in which nature appears in the city, is very interesting. Now, Japan has a lot of nature, it has a lot of greenery, but actually, in terms of a city like Tokyo, in proportional terms, they have fewer parks that you would find, for example, in London or in New York. So the attitude towards nature is something that is quite different and often is appreciated at a much smaller scale than we would find, in terms of, in the context of a city like London. The other thing that you'll see in this photograph, again, we won't have time to go into it, is really that since the 1960s, because Tokyo, they were basically occupied, and they've sort of more or less managed to, invite people to leave the Allied forces, the Americans, in the 1960s when they were doing the Olympic Stadium. And for that, they did a lot of transformation of the city, highways, things like that. And as a result of that, they built many of these highways, often covering small-scale canals and rivers and so on. So in the last 60 years, the city itself has changed quite dramatically, for example, the way in which water has disappeared, for example, from the city and how it's being recovered again or it's being rediscovered again. And I think the photos again capture something of this character of the city, the workmen, the vending machines, and then this kind of places where, for example, the canals or water would be rediscovered. So this is just to set the tone at the beginning of the book with this feel of little alleyways. And again, you see on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, these little potted plants. Tokyo is fantastic for this way in which nature is appreciated at a much, much more intimate scale, and how people are kind of looking after the area in front of their house, or how they are washing or throwing water symbolically as much kind of cleaning the city. So, and I think the other side of it is really the small scale, the two-story, three-story houses that are the remnant of kind of all the structures. So those photographs set the scene, and then we also deal with quite a bit of sort of data visualization, trying to understand the aging of the country, where you can see how the country is becoming really a kind of site of extremes, which is going places where we're all, whether it's in the UK or in the States, we're all going to go there, in the sense that there will be an increasingly aging population. The rate of pregnancy, childbirth, it's called the TFR, that stands for total fertility rate, is reducing in many, many places. The rate of divorce in places is increasing. The number of singles is increasing. So you hear, for example, on the left, you see the one in red, the increase in the population of like the people who will be singles or who are singles, but that is increasing. And as architects, as urbanists, you're also designing for a society of singles in a way. The idea of this sort of standard two-bedroom flat is no longer really the kind of median of things in a way. And then the whole question of privatization of public space or privatization of the city, because the growth of these developments also means that the city doesn't belong in a way, in the same way to the citizens. Of course, it's open, but the nature of the relationship is different. So this is in this first part where the question of degrowth is being explained. But at the same time, of course, we're looking for ideas, solutions, inventions, innovations. And here, for example, you see an image from a Japanese architect who was also influenced by Le Corbusier, worked there, called Yoshizaka, who did a series of amazing studies, urban studies, about the redistribution of the population away from metropolitan areas. But I think it's also very interesting, the kind of invention of these types of drawings that are looking at how to, the convention of making the flatlands, the rivers, where there could be new greenery that's coming. So the question of like looking at the city is not only a sort of architectural idea or an idea related to capital, but it's also related to forms of imagination and how people might be rethinking, in a way, the transformation of the city, and what kind of tools, what sort of conventions do we use. And then in the second part, this is sort of typical of a cluster of buildings that happens. This one is called Tokyo Midtown, and it's done by a company called Mitsui Fudosan. It's one of the three big developers, and SOM were the master planners for this. But the company themselves, they start by working with an advertising agency. They do a lot of branding investigation. They try to find who are the potential clients for this. And then they work with a big Japanese company. There are really two big architectural firms in Tokyo, and invariably one or the other is hired to work with the big developer. And then those big architectural firms are the liaison. They're the sort of local executive firms that work with the American companies that are doing the master planning. And then in this case, you can recognize that like the tall tower is done by SOM. And then some of the other buildings are given sometimes to other architects from abroad or from Japan. So that history is something that's actually interesting to delve into, and there's more of it in the book. But here we're showing you an example of what I was calling design research investigation. So one of these companies, the big developers, one of the three, the other one is called Mori, the Mori Corporation, and they were the people who developed Roppongi Hills, which is very well known, and design master plan by KPF. But here you see that they are in this area of Roppongi, and basically the top of the drawing, you see the first large-scale development that they did called Arc Hills. And then Roppongi is the one on the left. The more recent one, top right, is Toronomen Hill. They just are finishing the development at the bottom. So you can see basically the proximity of these very massive developments that they are doing, and they have basically their own kind of formula of mixed-use type development where retail is a big component of that. And again, it's beyond our sort of conversation tonight, but there is Jurdy was an American architect who was sort of the world's expert in retail architecture. And he did all the design for the lower levels of Roppongi Hills. So these projects that we're looking at are also exceptional because they're all what I would call sectional urbanism. They are designed in I mean, they're designed in 3D, but they're actually designed in a sense where the concept of the ground is questioned. And where is the ground is completely transformed in these projects in a way that we don't experience, let's say, in London in the same way. But of course, that will come. Here, this analysis shows the difference in terms of the formation of different kinds of developments. The one on the left is Mori. The one in the middle is, looking at different companies that are basically doing that, whether it's Mitsui, then Mitsubishi is the other one, and they have been doing these very large-scale offices and commercial development in the heart of the city. And then you see a kind of anomaly, the one to the right, which is how the area of Shinjuku in the west of Tokyo developed. There used to be a water purification plant, and then that became the basis for the development of this western part of the city, which is completely different than the other projects. And the one to the right is done by a railway company, Tokyo, and you can see how using the railway tracks makes a difference in terms of the formation of urban development and the kind of things that they can do because they have the tracks, but they also have the areas around the station. So I think now I can go through this quickly so that in contrast to that, they're really the neighborhoods. The only thing is that the word neighborhood doesn't actually exist in Japanese. So the Japanese have to come up with other names for neighborhood, which means like this locality or something like this. But it doesn't have the same sense of neighborliness or the relationship to other people in that neighborhood. So one of the interesting ideas related to the concept of neighborhood is when a group of women mainly created an idea of a kind of semi-fictional neighborhood in the sense that there are three Tokyo neighborhoods that they decided they will make one neighborhood out of it. And the way that they did it is by creating a magazine, by creating a journal. And this is like a newsletter. And this newsletter became a device for tying these three small neighborhoods together and putting these newsletters in the in the shops and things like this, and gradually creating a sort of tourist itinerary. It's actually like a situationist map of the city, and they did produce lots of maps to give people, this is the route if you're going to do this kind of shopping, this is what you do. And it's really amazingly interesting what this, especially the woman who wrote this initiatives in Janssen, Ms. Mori, made. And I think this idea of the neighborhoods connects to local cultural traditions like women's bathhouse. But on the left-hand side, you see in white the cluster of these three neighborhoods that they made together to call Yanasen, because it stands for Yanaka Nezu, Sendagi. These are the three neighborhoods, and they came up with a kind of branded idea of an area, which then they could make it into a tourist thing. And this is some of the kind of characteristics of these small-scale places. So the alternative to these is what? What do we do? So the book kind of sets up this dialogue between the big scale and the small scale. And right now there are a number of Japanese architects who are doing very interesting things at the scale of the neighborhood. One of them is an architect called Joe Nagasaka, who runs a firm called Schemata. And here you see, for example, a rice shop, but the way that the rice shop opens onto the neighborhood and becomes, in a way, part of a public space. It's not only dealing with the function of selling rice as a sort of traditional shop. So it's sort of like rethinking the shop. Or here at the top, they have done a bathhouse, but with a bar and coffee shop, combining these things. Or at the bottom is their office, but the office doors can open and become a sort of neighborhood thing in the sort of similar way that I think Tank are using, or gifting, their space to the city. But at the same time, some of the other developers, this is the case of one of the railway companies in Shibuya, they have also started to transform these large-scale projects. This one is called Shibuya Stream, was designed by a firm called Silicant. The main architect actually died not so long ago, aged like, I think, 40-something. But they tried to essentially revitalize the ground floor or the first 3 or 4 floors of the building and create new forms of occupancy or whatever to gift the spaces to the city, open up the canals, and this is being done by the railway company, which is also interesting. So, and then others, I really like the work of Erika Nakagawa, who's also doing small-scale things, but really trying to combine this idea of the very small scale, but something that's highly urban and highly dynamic in terms of how it works with the small scale, not just doing small building, but actually a vertical building, but a narrow building that can be in there. So for us, part of this polemic, if you like, is the idea that we need to think beyond conventional urban design. I work in the context of a school that has a big urban design, the first urban design program in America. And the question is that if you look at contemporary urban design, as we saw from these projects like Tokyo Midtown or Roppongi or in London, the way that these projects are happening in various parts of the city, they're really quite massive in terms of their scale. And then sometimes these things are a little bit too small scale. They're a bit too intimate. So the challenge was, can we create forms of urban transformation that's neither so tiny, nor is it something that is really the middle scale of urban transformation of the developers. And so part of the kind of rationale for what I've been doing in the design studios is to take certain areas, and because I have a group of 12 graduate students, instead of doing one project, I try, and it's kind of like really tough, sometimes a lot of pressure on them, but try to get them to do what I call, say, sometimes 2.5 projects, like so that there could be almost like 3 projects by saying 2.5. And then if there are 12, that means there are 36 projects. So this is a fragment of an area called Bakurocho, which is the garment district in Tokyo. But in the garment district, the elderly people are leaving and their families are not continuing to be in the garment business. So we have a lot of empty sites, but also other sites. So here is like one student who has a very white project that you see. You can't quite see it, but there is one insert with a side wall. So sort of transforming the convention of what is a typical site for a studio by taking roof air rights, by taking adjacencies, by taking multiple sites. So in one project, she is doing something which is to do with urban agriculture, but also using air rights and things like that. But on the right, it's sort of rethinking the idea of a shop, a gallery space, a workspace, a living space, all within one, but also adding kind of additional type spaces. So in a way, it requires a certain change in planning policy or zoning that obviously needs to be taken into account. But it's how to create the notion of a multiplicity in some ways that is not one firm, one master plan trying to produce the kind of appearance of diversity a lot of the time, that we really try to produce genuine diversity. And the only thing that's different about this, apart from this question of air rights and things like that, is the argument about the curating of multiple projects simultaneously. It's not just doing one at a time, but actually saying what happens if we think about the coordination at the urban level with the city, with multiple developers, with multiple architects, the idea of 30 projects in a way. And so that's, for me, that's like a different way of thinking about urban design than the convention of urban design as like what I've inherited through Jose Luis Sert, who was really the dean of Harvard and created this master's program in urban design, which is doing well. But the concept of sort of urban design, for me, has sort of stayed like that since the 1950s in some way, and hasn't quite gone through sufficient sort of transformation. So we build, for example, communal models, and this is a fragment of the model of Bakurocho. So we built the model of the whole of the neighborhood of Bakurocho, and then the students' projects are, inserted in some ways in terms of the whole thing. So you again are looking at a kind of corner of the site, but you can see that these projects are not all super conventional, but they are somehow using the idea of the kind of alternative life or lifestyles that can happen in them. And I think the students are also aware or familiar with Japanese novels and the way that novels describe urban life and kind of what it might be to live in the city. So this is really where we end, just giving you a sense of what our sort of counter proposals might begin to think about. A lot longer than I'd imagine, but thank you very much for listening to this. And thank you. Thank you.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.